Thank you for joining me for my presentation of Declawing Macavity, Writing to Learn Through Poetry. Before we begin, I would like to express that I have approached this from a non-traditional project standpoint. I have looked at this from both the literary analysis and a self-reflective position as a teacher. So I have tried to focus on student-centered learning, making the student the teacher and the knower of the information. I've also tried to incorporate this as a form of technology for the classroom through the idea of the flipped lesson plan. The flipped lesson itself is where you would watch a video much like this in the comfort of your own home and then come prepared from learning those concepts and apply them to a project or homework questions in class with the support of the teacher. Now, I did teach Macavity last year and I failed miserably, and largely that was in part to my own inability of recognizing what my students brought to the table as well as what their needs were. So I made the project much too broad. I made them analyze and compare the song of Macavity versus the poem of Macavity and tried to tell me how the different mediums displayed the theme. So instead of doing that, this is what I have for you. My overall goal for this project was to approach it like I would for my 7th graders and be able to present how I would introduce the material and teach it to them, as well as the expected outcomes that I have for them. I would also hope that you would gain both an understanding of how literary devices shape the understanding of a piece and how the presentation affects the interpretation. Overall, in order to understand a piece, we must make a personal connection to what we're reading. If we don't do that, then we're not taking our memories and what we know and creating a new memory and committing that to memory and saving that for use later. The overall interpretation of the poem's theme and thus its overall meaning is directly affected by the presentation of the piece's literary devices. So what we're going to look at is how what we know about a cat and criminals, as well as how those ideas are conveyed in the piece of Macavity, come together to help us understand what the theme of Macavity is. Now, before we jump into Macavity, there's a couple things I'm going to cover. First, I would like to think about middle school students themselves. Please approach this from either the viewpoint of a teacher, a parent, or a student. So middle school students themselves are constantly caught in the struggle of feeling naive and feeling like they're ready to take on the world and know what's going on. Part of that is because they're going through puberty, and because of that, they are incredibly emotional and have a lot of different temperaments when we come into the classroom. So we never know what we're going to get, but most days it's a lot of, why does this matter to me? So what we have to do is show them that there is a connection, that there is a reason why we are learning this, and a lot of this can be to help them transition from childhood to adulthood. Especially with poetry, you are getting those figurative language elements that are seen in the music that they have every day, in the jingles that are on commercials to help persuade you to buy a product, but they're also used to help create things. They're using your imagination, which is used in problem solving and critical thinking skills. As teachers, it's our job to create assignments where they can play with this, because right now they're in that stage where they think that they can't imagine anymore. They don't want to make believe or pretend, but they do need to hold on to that. That is what we are finding is getting lost, because we are making too many literal thinkers instead of critical thinkers. I've chosen to focus on writing to learn. I've included several quotes here that help to emphasize it, but what I would like to stress is that writing to learn started off as writing across the curriculum, writing in math, science, history, English, and all the electives in order to emphasize the importance of writing. Now, what it has developed into is more of an exploratory writing task. Instead of just writing a journal or taking notes, students are encouraged to write how they know and what they know. So instead of just writing a journal as if you were a literary character, you might write a piece of how you would explain it or teach it to the class. So this really gives the student a bit of self-discovery and creativity in approaching the material, because they are told that they know it. They are encouraged, which is something that very few students get from their peers, their teachers, and at home. So beyond the writing to learn process, which will be using a parody, I have chosen poetry itself because the poetry is a medium that allows students self-expression. A poem itself is the expression of thoughts, feelings, and ideas through the use of sound devices, figurative language, and imagery. Now, for me as a student, I used poetry all the time to express myself. I loved the idea that I could say what I wanted to without exactly saying it. I wanted to see who could find my hidden messages. And for students, poetry can be that great outlet and really reinforce that creative thinking. Beyond that, it allows you to be vulnerable. And when you share your poem, you have to have a safe space, which fosters a very good learning environment. And when we share poetry, it gives us that public speaking element, which helps to back up that Common Core idea of preparing for college and career readiness. Because how many times are you going to move up to being a leader in some sort of position and have to give a speech or tell someone how they need to do something? So when we look at Macavity with all of this in mind, there's a couple more things that I'd like to talk about. First, I want to reiterate what a couplet is. I would be coming at this with the idea that students already have these definitions, much like yourself. So a couplet itself is a rhymed pair of lines, and the lines can have the same or similar number of syllables. And what that does in Macavity is it helps to mimic the movement of a cat. We're going to discuss this, and it is fantastic. One way that we can help students is to do this writing to learn, asking them to keep notes, investing in the stanzas that they find particularly fascinating, or the rhymes, or the couplets. Especially when it comes to figurative language, we want them to keep those examples at the forefront. So you can use a graphic organizer, much like the one I've included here. There's also the importance of identifying what personification and extended metaphor are, because in this poem they go hand in hand. Personification is where human qualities are given to non-human things, and extended metaphors are where two unlike things are compared throughout a series of lines in a poem. So Macavity himself, the cat, is being compared to a criminal. That is our metaphor. And because Macavity is a cat, we have to use personification to make him more lifelike. So I'd like you to think for a moment about the cats that you have had experience with. What are they like? Some of the ones that I've had experience with have knocked things off counters. They kind of saunter around. And personally, cats have a really bad attitude. I'm sorry if I've offended any cat lovers out there. I'm sure that they are fuzzy and wonderful. But this cat has a bit of an attitude himself. So, jumping into Macavity, I'm going to start actually in the middle where we get the physical description, because that's going to be the emphasis for the assignment that I'm asking students to do. Beyond that, we're going to get a taste of the first couple of stanzas in the song from the musical Cats. So, looking at the description of Macavity, please close your eyes and kind of listen along as I read the poem to you. Listen for those cat-like movements. So we have, Macavity's a ginger cat. He is very tall and thin. You would know him if you saw him, for his eyes are sunken in. His brow is deeply lined in thought. His head is highly domed. His coat is dusty from neglect. His whiskers are uncombed. He sways his head from side to side with movements like a snake. And when you think he's half asleep, he's always wide awake. So it has this sort of bounce. And when you think of a cat walking around, they do have that little bit of lilt from their hips shifting back and forth. We get the personification in the brow deeply lined in thought. You know, we've already also had him compared to a magician and breaking the law of gravity, breaking human laws. So he has the capability of being human-like. Again, that's personification. When we look at specifically the last couplet in the third stanza, where it says that he sways his head from side to side, we also have alliteration mimicking the sound for the snake. And we also have it rhyming with awake. So we have this idea where you think one thing, but you have to accept a separate reality. Again, this is something that really connects with our students, because you have this idea of the outcast, this unaccepted criminal who is not appreciated. But the poem itself, when you listen to it, is almost praising Macavity, especially in the refrain. Macavity, Macavity, there's no one like Macavity, for he's a fiend in feline shape, a monster of depravity. You may meet him in a by-street, you may see him in the square, but when a crime's discovered, Macavity's not there. So you have this idea of this cat who can escape anything, but there's the impression that this is a remarkable feat. So similarly to our students in the idea that they can't do this, especially with poetry. It really reaffirms and encourages them to not listen to what others say and look for the good in everything. When we finally get down to the end of the poem, there's also the comparison made that Napoleon is very similar to Macavity. We've already discussed how he is, evading Scotland Yard. He's evading the Secret Service. This guy knows what he's doing, but it's not a guy. And it's so easy to say. Unless we focus on the fact that he's a cat, you often get lost in that. So when we focus on the outcomes of Macavity and we think about how the literary devices play, it's important to keep in mind that this is a children's poem. T.S. Eliot actually wrote Macavity in a letter to his godson and later published it in a selection of poems about cats and animals. This ended up becoming the basis for the musical Cats. Macavity, the song itself, is inspired, and the entire musical is inspired by the poem Macavity. So you will get another sense, especially from the jazz undertones and the dissonant tones of the song, when we listen real quick to a short clip. So you have the quick pace of the cat sneaking up on something and pouncing, and the chase ensues. You get the xylophone of the mouse or whatever animal's being chased trying to scurry away. The dissonant tones help to create this mood of ominous evil, and now it's slowing down, getting more sneaky. Here's our snake-like movement, and then we're going to hear a little bit about Macavity. The beauty of the performer is that her voice also mimics the sounds of a cat, so it really reiterates along with the rhythm, the slinky movement of a cat.
The bafflement of Scotland Yard, the flying squad's despair. But when they reach the scene of crime, Macavity's not there.
Again, I am including this on the website, so please feel free to come and check this out further. I know this is a brief overview, and I greatly appreciate you bearing with me, but hopefully you've noticed by now through both the poem and the song the mimic of the cat movement and how it has kind of coexisted with the criminal, because criminals sneak just like cats do. You'll also notice the figurative language, the personification we've already discussed, as well as the use of the extended metaphor, and how the rhyme and word choice itself backs up that metaphor of the constant back and forth of, is this a good guy, is this the bad guy? Hopefully you've also picked out the jazz tones like I tried to mention, and if you aren't aware, it's ironic, but probably a very deliberate decision to use those, because jazz itself was an illegal art form when it was first introduced in the 1920s, around the same time that Macavity was introduced to the godson of T.S. Eliot. So how does this tie into Macavity? Now that we have looked at the song and what we know and the poem itself, we need to focus on the comprehension and literary analysis of the piece itself. So in order to do that, you can ask some basic questions like I have listed up top, and the literary analysis questions listed below, asking about the rhyme scheme and about the specific details mentioned in the poem itself as far as the appearance of Macavity. Now, the importance of checking for understanding from this point before beginning an actual project is crucial, because if they do not understand the concepts, you need to go back and reteach somewhere. So you can have something as simple as this chart listed below that asks you to define the appearance, personality, and behavior of Macavity as per the writing of the poem. So they would need to, in little bubbles out on the side, fill in lines that give specific examples of those descriptions. From here, you would go to critical thinking questions that make the student ask why or how questions. So when you look at some of the examples that I have, you have specifics about the couplets, what you hear in the poems, as well as how you could think about the way the poem works in relation to the classroom or the lunchroom, so that Students get in the habit of mimicking sounds with words before they actually start their final project. When you look at the final assignment, the parody is a perfect example of writing to learn and kind of coming to a culmination of what we've been discussing today. Because if you do not understand the theme and you don't understand how things work, then you cannot create a proper final assignment in the form of a parody. You would need to understand the use of the couplet in order to create the poem. You would need to understand personification and extended metaphor in order to properly portray the animal of your choosing. So the final assignment I have selected is to create a parody using the animal of your choice. You would have to make sure to detail the appearance, behavior, and personality of that animal. The final project needs to have at least 3 stanzas, and the reason I say at least 3 is that it gives a bare minimum for the student who is not as confident and allows the more gifted student to go beyond and do more. So this really differentiates the instruction quite nicely, I think. Finally, I would like to kind of go back to what my goals were. Again, I tried to focus on this from a teacher's perspective and make it as simple for a 7th grade mindset, and use that in order to show you how to appreciate this poem in a different way that you may not have already had by using the literary devices in order to understand the piece, as well as looking at the presentation overall. Because looking at the poem alone is good, and using the music itself is good, and using them to support each other can be even better and help those struggling learners to see the attitudes of the poem itself. One thing I could suggest is once you listen to the song, please go back and reread the poem, because you get a new understanding of rhythm when you hear or have heard that song before. So again, my idea was to use a personal connection to what you're reading in order to really understand it. Using your previous experiences with cats and using your memories of cats in order to understand Macavity, as well as criminal experiences and things that help to identify those conflicting attitudes, really helps to emphasize the theme, which I have found to be this appreciation of Macavity. He is this cat that can do things that no other cat can do, and so while he is an outcast, he is something remarkable, which is something that all students can identify with. So the overall interpretation of the poem's theme, and thus its overall meaning, is in fact directly affected by the presentation of the piece's literary devices. If we had not had that use of rhyme scheme, if we had not had that personification especially, or the extended metaphor, that appreciation might not be there. We might focus on the criminal aspect or on the cat aspect alone. Or we might look at it as he's just being a pesky cat. There's nothing remarkable about him. Nobody wants him. So it would be a very sad and very different interpretation. I really would like to thank you for joining me today and taking the time to view this presentation with me. And overall, just look at the bigger picture, because how much fun can exploring reading be when we take the time to really dive into it.